It starts with a single word. A word that still echoes through a phone line frozen in time. Oh shit. And then, nothing. No crash. No struggle. No sound at all. Just silence. 19-year-old Brandon Swanson was walking down a quiet rural road in Minnesota, talking to his parents, guiding them toward him. They were so close. Close enough to hear his footsteps through the receiver. But somewhere in that blackness, between the sound of gravel and breath, Brandon vanished. 15 years later, there's still no sign of him. Not a trace, not a clue. Just that one final word hanging in the air. How does someone disappear while on the phone with their parents? How can a voice, a living, breathing presence, be there 1 second and gone the next? Welcome to Cold Case Reopened, where the past never stays buried. Tonight, we revisit the haunting mystery of Brandon Swanson, one of America's most chilling vanishings caught in real time. Before we begin, write down in the comments what time and place you're watching from. It's always fascinating to see how far these stories travel. And if you haven't yet, hit like, subscribe, and turn on the bell, so you never miss the truth hiding behind the silence. 47 minutes. That's how long the call lasted. A thread of sound stretched between a 19-year-old boy and the two people trying to reach him through the dark. 47 minutes between life and disappearance. It begins simply enough. A late-night ring, a mother's tired voice, a son's quiet apology. I went off the road a little. I'm fine, just stuck. I can see the town lights from here. On one side of the line, Brandon Swanson walks along a dirt road somewhere in southwest Minnesota, his sneakers scuffing gravel under a low sky. On the other, his parents, Brian and Annette, drive through a labyrinth of county roads, guided only by their son's voice. The dashboard clock glows 1:30 a.m. They stay on the phone, because in places like this, cell service is fragile, and so is luck. For a while it feels routine, a simple inconvenience. He laughs once, trying to sound unbothered. Guess I took a wrong turn. His father chuckles back, the way parents do when they're annoyed but grateful it isn't worse. You can almost hear their relief through the static. They believe they're minutes away from finding him. But the countryside has a way of swallowing certainty. They flash their headlights. He flashes his. Nothing. The distance between them begins to feel less like geography and more like a wall. Brandon insists he sees the faint glow of Lynn ahead. Just a few miles, he says. His father drives toward it. The call stays open, the night stretching longer with every unanswered landmark. There's sound. Faint. Rhythmic. The shuffle of his steps, the crunch of gravel, the whisper of wind through fields. At times you can hear him breathe harder, the strain of walking uphill. Every few minutes, Brian calls out his name, half to locate him, half to make sure he's still there. I'm fine, Brandon answers. Always calm, always steady. Somewhere between words, something shifts. His voice grows quieter. He mentions a fence, a small creek, maybe a river nearby. His mother listens carefully, her voice soft but urgent. Stay where you are, honey. Just keep talking. He does. Until he doesn't. At 1:54 a.m., the calm breaks. There's a sharp intake of breath, startled, abrupt, followed by two words, loud enough to jolt them upright. Oh shit. Then, silence. Not a click, not a tone. Just a hollow, infinite quiet. They call his name again. Once, twice. Nothing answers. The call remains open, still connected, but their son is gone. Minutes pass. They keep talking into the emptiness, unwilling to let go. The phone hums softly, the way a line does when someone's still there. Or maybe when they're not. Out beyond the headlights, the fields stay still, the night offering no clues, no sound, no movement. When the line finally goes dead, something larger than silence settles in. The kind that doesn't end when morning comes. Because before anyone can begin to understand how Brandon Swanson vanished, they have to understand who he was. and why an ordinary boy's disappearance would haunt a whole town for the next 15 years. On Saturday mornings in Marshall, you could find him in a driveway with the hood popped and a coffee can full of bolts at his feet. Neighbors knew the drill. A sputtering mower, a stubborn tiller, the old four-wheeler that hadn't started since deer season. Brandon would wipe his hands on a shop rag, grin with that shy, gap-toothed smile he never liked in photos, and ask, "What's it doing?" For gas money and a thank you, he'd bring small engines back to life. The town didn't just recognize his face. It recognized the sound of something repaired and running again. He grew up on streets where last names doubled as directions. Teachers remembered him for steady effort, not showboating. Friends remembered long drives on county roads and cheap burgers after. In the school shop, he made time for anyone who didn't understand a torque spec or why a carburetor floods. Nothing grand, nothing flashy, just the patient satisfaction of understanding how things work and why they stop. There is a particular smell to his world: the almond bite of gasoline, the metallic sweetness of warm oil, the dusty breath of old garages with their pegboards and paint cans. He'd set his phone on a fender, sleeves pushed to his elbows, listening to music low while he tuned a carb needle by touch. On cold days, his breath would fog as he leaned over a pull cord, the machine coughing once, twice, and then catching. One of those small victories that leaves a person standing a little taller. People trusted him. Not with secrets, necessarily, but with their everyday problems, which in a place like Marshall is almost the same thing. A neighbor's snowblower on the eve of a storm, a buddy's pickup the week before a move, a lawnmower the day before a birthday cookout. He showed up. He stayed until the thing started. He didn't make a fuss about it. His ambitions were rooted in that same plain-spoken pride. He'd finished his first year studying wind turbine tech at Minnesota West, a program that combined what he liked best: mechanics, height, and weather. The towers fascinated him. How you climb into wind that never stops talking. How a city's worth of power can hum quietly over a field of soybeans. He talked about safety harnesses the way some people talk about guitars, with respect for the details. The future he pictured wasn't abstract. It had a paycheck, a pickup with decent tires, and a reason to get up before dawn. At home, he kept things simple. He'd ask to borrow his mom's debit card rather than assume. He rinsed his own dishes. He teased about borrowing the family car and returned it with more fuel than before. These are small facts, almost too ordinary to notice, until you try to understand the size of a hole when someone goes missing. Ordinary life is what outlines the absence. The town reflected him back. In the grocery line, someone would nudge and say, "That kid fixed my snowblower." In the hardware store, he'd linger in the aisle with spark plugs and gasket maker, considering brands the way other teenagers compare sneakers. He asked the older mechanics questions, and they answered because he listened. There is a craft to learning: hands first, then books, then hands again. Documentary truth lives in these edges. No whispers of runaway plans, no sudden dramatic conflicts. Just a kid with steady habits, a calendar full of work days, and a knack for machines that resist. If there's a mystery in that, it's this: the better you know him, the harder it becomes to imagine him stepping off the map. And yet, forewarning travels in small signals. The spring of 2008 ran cool. Night fell early on back roads where GPS faltered and landmarks blur into each other after midnight. Cell bars flickered and vanished between farm silos. Friends said goodbye after an ordinary evening. And Brandon, practical as always, talked about tomorrow like it was guaranteed. "We leave him here for just a breath longer," sleeves pushed up, a thumb streaked with grease, lining parts on a towel in the order they'll go back in. The kind of mind that keeps a path in pieces so it can be rebuilt. Next comes the night itself, the last hours before the call, when headlights drift across gravel and a simple choice of route turns into the hinge on which everything swings. It was supposed to be just another small-town celebration, the start of summer, not the end of a story. Marshall was shaking off the last bite of spring that night, windows down, music spilling from parked cars, and the faint scent of tilled earth rising from fields still cold from rain. Classes were over, finals done. The kind of night when the air itself feels like relief. Brandon Swanson had driven up to Canby that afternoon. a half hour on familiar roads that threaded through farmland and sleepy intersections. He had a quiet confidence about him, the kind that came from plans finally lining up. One semester behind him, a job prospect waiting, a summer of small repairs and paychecks ahead. Nothing extraordinary, which is why it hurts more to retrace. The gathering wasn't wild, not the kind that ends in trouble. Just a few friends, a mix of local college kids, a stereo propped against a porch rail, and the faint hum of crickets under the baseline. Someone grilled burgers, someone else brought a cooler. Brandon stayed light with the drinks. 2 beers over several hours. Enough to be sociable, not enough to blur his sense of direction. He laughed easily, that understated kind of laugh that doesn't demand attention. To the people there, it was an ordinary night that would dissolve into memory. Around 11:30, he said his goodbyes. He mentioned needing an early start the next day. The house lights spilled across the gravel as he walked to his car, a weathered green Chevy Lumina that coughed once before settling into idle. He waved, probably without realizing anyone would remember that small gesture in such detail later. The drive home should have been uneventful, roughly 30 miles of open country. Out here, the night wraps around you fast. Highways turn to 2 lanes, 2 lanes to gravel. He chose the back roads, the ones less traveled, maybe to save a few minutes, or to enjoy the quiet. The sky was moonless, stars pressed close. The sound of tires on loose rock echoed like static. It's easy to imagine what he saw. The ghostly silver of power lines, the reflection of his own headlights bending around a curve, the dark sea of farmland stretching endlessly in both directions. Every mile looked like the last. Every intersection felt almost familiar. That's the thing about rural nights. They don't tell you when you've gone too far until you already have. Phone records would later show he called his parents just before midnight. Calm, direct, unhurried. He told them he'd taken a wrong turn but wasn't worried. He'd figure it out. That simple confidence, the same that made him good with machines, followed him into the dark. As he drove deeper into the grid of county roads, the pavement gave way to dirt. The tires hummed lower, the ride roughened. At some point, his headlights caught the edge of a ditch. Shallow, invisible, until it wasn't. The car slid in gently, nose first, the back tires spinning once before settling. No crash, no panic, just a soft mistake on a quiet road. He tried to back out, the sound of tires grinding into soft soil. When that failed, he did what any calm, responsible kid would do. He reached for his phone, scrolled through his contacts, and called home. The night was still and indifferent. Somewhere behind him, a field sighed under wind. Somewhere ahead, the nearest porch light was miles away. Brandon didn't know it yet, but this road, this turn, this call, would soon fracture his life into a before and an after. No crash, no skid marks, no shattered glass, just a car quietly trapped in the ditch. The Chevy Lumina leaned forward on the soft shoulder of a gravel road, headlights cutting short into a field of dry grass. Inside, Brandon sat behind the wheel, the low rumble of the idling engine the only sound for miles. It wasn't panic that filled the car, just irritation, that small, familiar kind that comes with getting stuck when you should have been home 20 minutes ago. He shifted into reverse, rocked the car once, twice. The tires spun and sank deeper. He exhaled through his nose, almost laughing to himself. He killed the engine, stepped out, and was met by a silence so complete it felt physical. The air smelled of damp soil and gasoline. The wind came in long, patient sighs across the open field. He stood there a moment, hands on his hips, scanning the horizon. There, far away, a faint shimmer of light. A town, he thought. Lind, maybe. It had to be Lind. The glow was distant but steady, something to orient himself by. He climbed back in, reached for his phone, and called home. It rang twice before his father answered. "Hey, Dad," Brandon said, voice calm. "Went off the road a bit. I can't get it out." A pause. Then the steady reassurance of a parent already halfway to action. All right, we'll come get you. You safe? Yeah, Brandon said. I can see the town lights. Not far. He gave directions as best he could. Left at the gravel turn, then straight for a few miles. He kept his voice level, never hinting at fear, because there wasn't any. Not yet. This was fixable. This was routine. He switched on his hazard lights, orange flashes in the distance, rhythmic, patient. The kind of beacon that, from the right spot, would be impossible to miss. While his parents pulled onto the road in their envoy, Brandon stayed on the line, talking them through every bend he could remember. The call became a tether, sound as compass. He described landmarks by feel rather than name. A clump of trees, a split fence post, a low patch of fog hugging the road. The night pressed thicker now, the kind that dulls perspective. The fields blurred into one dark sea, fences indistinguishable from shadow. From his car, the glow of the distant town pulsed faintly. Always there, always slightly too far away. On the other end of the call, his parents' headlights carved through the dark. The gravel crunched, the road dust rose behind them like smoke. Annette leaned forward, scanning the sides of the road for a glint of metal. The reflection of her son's car. Nothing. Flash your lights again, Brian said. Brandon flicked them on and off, waiting. I don't see you, his father murmured. Me neither, Brandon replied. His voice stayed calm, but underneath, the smallest edge of confusion began to form. That quiet disbelief when something simple refuses to make sense. They drove farther. He walked a little. The call remained open. Between them stretched a darkness both vast and strangely close, like the space between two mirrors reflecting endlessly. Every so often he'd say, I think I hear your car. Every so often, Brian would answer, we must be right near you. But they weren't. Their lights, for all their searching, never crossed. And somewhere out there on that nameless road, one set of headlights parked and flashing, the other moving steadily closer, but never finding the same air to occupy. A pattern began that would last for the next 47 minutes. The kind of moment where proximity becomes illusion, and a family starts chasing its own echo through the dark. They heard his breathing, his footsteps, his world, until the moment it all stopped. In the first minutes, everything sounded ordinary. Brandon's voice was calm, his words precise, almost matter-of-fact. He told his parents he'd slipped into a ditch but was fine. No damage, no panic. The line stayed open as he guided them toward what he thought was the town of Lind. His dad drove carefully, headlights sweeping across the gravel, both of them describing the same landscape that somehow looked different from opposite ends of the same night. The road hums under tires. On Brandon's side, gravel crunches beneath his sneakers. The sounds blend. A conversation of engines, footsteps, and hope. By the 10th minute, they should have seen each other. He flashed his headlights. His dad flashed his back. Nothing. A quiet confusion began to form, the kind that doesn't yet feel dangerous, just strange. Brandon said he could see the faint glow of town lights ahead, soft and orange like a promise. He started walking toward them, confident the distance was short. His parents agreed to keep driving slowly, matching his directions as best they could. Still, the horizon remained empty. Around the 15th minute, the conversation grew quieter. He described his surroundings. A line of trees to one side, a field of corn stubble to the other. His breath came through the phone, steady but more deliberate. The night was cold, dipping into the 30s. His mother reminded him to stay on the road. He said he would. The sound of wind threaded faintly through the speaker, and once or twice, a metallic clink. Maybe a gate, maybe a fence. Every detail they heard felt like progress, even when it wasn't. At roughly the 25th minute, things began to feel off. Brian told his son what he saw ahead. A curve, a bridge, a cluster of mailboxes. But Brandon didn't recognize any of it. Their descriptions no longer matched. Two different versions of rural Minnesota had somehow folded over each other, and the line between them was invisible. They both said, "We're close." They both believed it, and yet the night refused to let either of them prove it. By the 30th minute, their tones changed. Brandon's footsteps slowed. The crunch softened. He mentioned hearing water, a soft murmur, nearby but unseen. "Might be a creek," he said. His dad told him to be careful. His mother's voice followed, quieter, steadying. There was a pause, then his voice again. "Yeah, I'm fine." The words hung longer than they should have. As the 40th minute approached, the connection itself seemed heavier. The sounds of his steps came closer to the microphone, slower, uneven. He said he was crossing something. Maybe a gate, maybe a small dip in the road. His parents asked him to honk his horn so they could locate him. The faint beep reached them through the line, muffled and far away. It should have been close. But they heard it, as though from another world. At the 46th minute, something shifted. His breathing quickened slightly. Not panicked, but strained. The phone rustled as he adjusted his grip. Then came a scrape, the faint sound of brush or branches. A single footstep landed heavier than the rest. Then, at the 47th minute, the sound that has haunted them ever since. A startled intake of breath. A sharp exhale. And Brandon's voice, tight and sudden. "Oh shit." Then, nothing. Not static. Not the sound of a dropped call. Just silence. Clean. Absolute. Unnatural. His parents called his name. Once. Twice. A third time. The line stayed open. Unbroken. But empty. They listened, waiting for the smallest proof of life. A cough, a rustle, a step. There was only the faint hum of the phone's receiver, like breath that wasn't really there. Hey didn't hang up. They couldn't. The connection felt like the last fragile thread tying them to their son. Minutes passed, 5, maybe more, before the call finally cut itself off. They didn't hang up. They couldn't. The connection felt like the last fragile thread tying them to their son. Minutes passed, 5, maybe more, before the call finally cut itself off. When morning came, that silence turned into a search. Deputies traced the signal to an open stretch of farmland, miles from where he believed he was. The car was there, doors unlocked, wallet inside, hazards off. And the realization set in. Brandon hadn't just disappeared from sight. He'd vanished from geography itself. When dawn broke, the map itself became the first suspect. Light crept slowly over the farmland, brushing frost across the edges of ditches and fence lines. Deputies stood by their patrol cars, radios murmuring, eyes squinting at a landscape that looked identical in every direction. Out here, the difference between north and west was often just a matter of where the wind decided to lean. The ping from Brandon's last known signal had pointed them toward one set of coordinates, a rural stretch near Lynn. But when the first cruiser rolled down the dirt road that morning, the coordinates didn't match the voice on the phone. The world had shifted 25 miles northwest, to the outskirts of Taunton, a place Brandon never mentioned, a place that made no sense. There, on a nameless township road, sat his car. Perfectly upright, perfectly still. No tire marks led in or out. No broken grass. No footprints pressed into the mud. The green Chevy Lumina looked as if it had been gently placed there, waiting to be found, but refusing to explain itself. The doors were unlocked. The keys rested neatly in the center console. His wallet lay on the passenger seat. Untouched. Casual. Wrong. The air smelled of diesel from passing farm trucks. A reminder that the world was still carrying on, even as something here had fallen completely out of sequence. Deputies circled the vehicle, speaking in clipped tones. "Looks clean. No signs of struggle. No mud under the wheel wells." To anyone else, it would look like a car that had simply stopped. But to the people who had heard that 47-minute call, the breathing, the walking, the calm, and then the sudden break, this was something else entirely. The geography didn't line up. Brandon had described fences, lights, a creek, things that didn't exist anywhere near where the car was found. It was as if he had been narrating an entirely different county. Somehow, his voice had been routed through a landscape that wasn't the one beneath his feet. And that contradiction, that fracture between sound and place, became the first real wound in the case. By mid-morning, the family stood near the car, faces drawn tight against the cold wind. The same car that had once carried him home from class now looked lifeless, drained of everything human. The morning sun glinted off the windshield, and for a second, you could almost mistake it for peaceful, until you realized what was missing. Inside, the radio dial was still set to his favorite station. The half-empty water bottle in the cup holder had collected dew overnight. Every detail was mundane, and because of that, unbearable. One deputy marked the location on a paper map, the kind with creases worn soft from years of glove box use. Another made a note. Phone ping inconsistent with location. That simple line would haunt every report written after it. To this day, no one can explain it cleanly. How did he describe one landscape while standing in another? How does a voice travel farther than a body? The questions echoed louder than the wind rolling over the open fields. As the sun climbed higher, the first volunteers began to arrive. Neighbors, farmers, local firemen still in work boots. They formed loose lines across the road, scanning the ditches, the fields, the tree lines. What began as disbelief was already hardening into something else. Resolve. The neatness of that car, so still, so undisturbed, became the last piece of order before chaos took over. By noon, the radio chatter had shifted from disbelief to action. Search grids, foot patrols, water units, helicopter requests. The landscape that had swallowed one boy was about to be swallowed by the search for him. And from this moment on, the investigation would stop being about what Brandon said at night, and start being about what the land itself refused to reveal. 2 miles south of where the car sat abandoned, the trail seemed almost eager to begin. And then, without warning, it ended. The bloodhounds started just after sunrise. Thick leather leashes, handlers in reflective vests, their breath visible in the cool air. They were given Brandon's scent from the driver's seat of the Lumina, the faint personal trace left behind by skin on fabric, the human imprint that outlasts presence. The dogs took to it immediately. Noses low, tails high, they moved with purpose down the gravel road, the crowd of volunteers and deputies following at a careful distance. It was quiet work. You could hear the gravel crunching, the wind moving through dry grass, and the occasional clipped instruction from a handler. Easy. Track. At first, the direction made sense. South, then east, toward open fields bordered by thin tree lines. The route wound through terrain that matched fragments of Brandon's last words: fences, brush, and uneven ground. For a moment, it felt like the case was finally tracing its way back to logic. The handlers radioed updates as they moved. Track strong. Good pull. Still heading south. Each word brought a small surge of relief to those following. The kind of hope that builds quietly, measured in footsteps and leashes rather than emotion. But then, near the banks of the Yellow Medicine River, everything changed. The dogs slowed. Their pace faltered, heads lifting toward the wind. The lead handler knelt, checked the ground, and gave the leash a gentle tug. The dogs circled once, twice, then stopped. One sat down, whining softly. The other simply looked toward the water, ears twitching, waiting for instruction that didn't come. Across the muddy bank, the river moved lazily, reflecting a dull silver sky. It wasn't deep, barely chest-high in places, but the water ran cold and deceptive, curling around rocks in silent spirals. Deputies walked the edge, scanning for shoe prints or drag marks. There were none. The river, in its indifference, had erased its own answers. Searchers debated quietly. Could he have crossed? Could he have slipped? The surface gave nothing away. Only a dark swirl where current met stone, as if the river itself was swallowing the story. Hours passed. More dogs were brought in. They traced the same path, looped the same area, and each one stopped at the same spot, a small rise just before the water. To seasoned handlers, that meant one thing. The trail ended here. Not lost. Ended. It was the first point in the investigation where the natural world felt complicit. Not cruel, just absolute. Helicopters passed overhead, their rotors scattering leaves along the bank. Divers tested the current, moving slowly through the opaque water, hands sweeping the riverbed inch by inch. On the surface, men in waders marked sections with bright flags. Beneath the surface, the water muted everything. Sound, color, time. They found nothing. No fabric, no phone, no trace of human passage. By nightfall, the riverbank was taped off, the grass stamped down by boots. Deputies marked the spot on their map, drawing a small red circle and a single note beside it. Sent terminus. That phrase would echo through every subsequent report, every conversation, every anniversary of the case. The place where Brandon's trail, his literal existence, seemed to stop mid-stride. Back in town, the news spread quickly. The story had already changed once with the car in the wrong location. Now it shifted again, anchored to a river that refused to explain itself. But in small towns, mysteries don't stay confined to paper maps and police files. They bleed into community, into rumor, into the determination of people who can't accept an ending without evidence. By the next morning, more than 100 volunteers had gathered, boots lined at the edge of the fields, radios crackling, coffee steaming from paper cups. They came ready to search. Not for theories, not for closure, but for something tangible. And as the first sweep lines stretched out across the prairie, the quiet river behind them became both the starting point and the warning. This land could keep secrets. What began as a single night's confusion was about to turn into one of Minnesota's largest search operations. A test of endurance, faith, and the limits of what a community can bear. The first day, there were a few dozen volunteers. By the end of the week, there were 600. Men and women from every corner of Lyon County, farmers, students, off-duty EMTs, showed up in boots and flannel, their breath clouding in the cold spring air. Pickup trucks lined the rural roads for miles. Coffee urns steamed on the hoods of cars. It felt less like a search party and more like a community heartbeat. Helicopters came first. Black Hawk rotors churned the morning fog into white veils that hovered above the fields. From the air, the land looked endless, stitched with drainage ditches and narrow creeks. Deputies mapped the flight paths, marking each grid with fluorescent flags. To those watching below, the sound of blades overhead became a kind of hope. The noise meant motion, meant someone was out there looking. On the ground, rows of searchers moved shoulder to shoulder through waist-high grass, guided by GPS markers. They carried poles to probe old cisterns and sinkholes, ropes for riverbanks, and flashlights even during daylight, in case anything small caught the sun the wrong way. Each sweep ended with the same ritual. Heads down, quiet nods, no discovery. Then they'd regroup, shift a few hundred yards, and start again. Divers entered the Yellow Medicine River, slow and methodical. The current was calm on the surface, but unpredictable beneath. Visibility was near zero. Hands worked by feel alone, brushing across rocks, roots, and the soft drag of silt. When they surfaced, faces pale from cold, they shook their heads before anyone had to ask. Nothing. By the third day, the local cafe had turned into a command post. Maps covered the walls, pins marking every direction Brandon could have taken. His high school shop teacher brought sandwiches. The pastor brought thermoses of coffee. People who had never met the Swansons handed out gloves and batteries, the kind of generosity that only exists where everyone's worst fear feels suddenly possible. Night searches carried their own kind of weight. Floodlights lit the fields like daylight, throwing long shadows that danced with every movement. The hum of generators mixed with the murmur of quiet voices and the distant barking of search dogs. Every so often, someone thought they saw something, a shoe print, a scrap of fabric. But the discoveries always dissolved into ordinary debris. broken glass, a can, nothing human. Days turned to weeks. Helicopters gave way to drones. Technology filled in the gaps where endurance began to fail. Aerial cameras swept for irregular shapes, heat signatures, movement, but the screens stayed blank. Brandon's name echoed constantly over the radio. Search line 2 clear. Search line 3 moving south. No contact. In town, porch lights stayed on long after midnight. Parents double-checked that their children got home safe. The community, in its quiet way, began holding its breath. Yet even in exhaustion, no one walked away. Every weekend, the search lines reformed. They moved through fields that had already been covered 10 times before, because maybe this time, the light would hit differently. Maybe the land was waiting for a reason to give him back. When the official operations finally paused, it wasn't because anyone stopped believing. It was because human bodies needed rest. The fields lay bare, trampled in wide arcs, but the mystery had only deepened. The last helicopter left a scar of noise that faded into an empty horizon. And in that silence, the town realized something impossible. You can search every inch of ground, every ditch, every mile of river, and still be no closer to the truth. Brandon Swanson hadn't been found. Not his phone, not a shoe, not a single piece of him. And so the story shifted again, away from what could be seen and into what could only be guessed. Theories began to bloom, spreading through the cafes, the command posts, the quiet corners of living rooms where people still whispered his name. What could make a person vanish so cleanly, in a place so familiar? That question would soon divide searchers, investigators, and even neighbors, each holding a piece of belief in the same unsolvable puzzle. If not the river, then where? If not an accident, then what? After weeks of searching every visible inch of land, investigators and volunteers began shifting from footsteps to speculation. The case had become less about distance and more about possibility. Every theory dissected, tested, and eventually undone. The drowning theory was the first and most logical. The dogs had stopped near the Yellow Medicine River. It was cold that night, the current unpredictable, the footing slick. Maybe Brandon slipped while crossing, hit his head, and the current carried him downstream. It was simple, almost merciful in its clarity. But the divers had gone over that water again and again, tethered to ropes, sweeping inch by inch, and found nothing. Not a shoe, not a thread of fabric. The river wasn't deep enough or fast enough to hide a body for long. Logic eroded there, the way water eats at stone. Then came hypothermia, the quiet killer of the unprepared. Temperatures had dropped into the 30s, cold enough to numb fingers and scramble judgment. If he'd been disoriented or injured, the night could have overtaken him easily. Some believed he'd wandered until exhaustion set in, then simply laid down and never got back up. But that, too, failed to hold. A body succumbing to cold doesn't vanish. It leaves trace. Clothing, bone, something. And 600 people had combed every field within miles. The prairie keeps many secrets, but it rarely erases completely. The darker whisper was foul play. A passing driver, a stranger, a chance encounter on an empty road. The exclamation, those 2 words, "Oh shit," sounded like fear, maybe confrontation. But there was no sign of struggle, no evidence of another vehicle, no theft. Nothing that suggested violence had touched that moment. To believe foul play, you had to believe in coincidence of impossible timing. Someone stumbling into that exact stretch of emptiness at that exact second. Another theory drifted up from the old-timers who knew these back roads best: the hidden well. Minnesota farmland is pocked with forgotten hazards. Open cisterns, sinkholes, and wells left to history. Maybe he'd fallen into one. His voice cut off mid-breath. The image was horrifying, but it made sense in a rural logic sort of way. Yet even that fell apart. Farmers surveyed every plot for miles, checked every well cap and old silo, mapped them all. Ground-penetrating radar was brought in. No voids, no gaps. The land was intact. The last and least accepted was the idea of escape, that Brandon had walked away deliberately, starting over somewhere else. But the people who knew him, his parents, his friends, his professors, dismissed it instantly. He wasn't running from anything. He was calling home to be found. There was no evidence of debt, depression, or secret life. He had plans, and more importantly, he had intention. You don't make a 47-minute phone call if your goal is to disappear. Each theory carried its own logic, each one neatly folded into a file. Each one collapsed under its own weight. None could explain the precision of absence, the perfect blank that had replaced a human life. Investigators began to use words like anomaly and inconclusive, cold, bureaucratic terms that barely masked frustration. Families want reasons, officers want proof, but this case offered neither. It sat in that thin air between probability and impossibility, the place where evidence refuses to cooperate. Over time, the list of possibilities didn't shrink. It expanded into nothingness. What was once a narrow path of facts had widened into open prairie again, and every direction led to the same quiet conclusion. Brandon Swanson had simply ceased to exist within the boundaries of the visible world. And it's there, in that space between logic and loss, that something new began to take shape. Not another theory, but a kind of moral exhaustion. Because when a community exhausts the physical, all that's left is the philosophical. What happens when truth itself refuses to be found? That question would soon give way to something even more human. A family's determination to turn grief into action. And out of that silence, a law would be born. No body, no belongings, no answers. In the aftermath of months spent searching, the landscape itself became the only witness left. Every field, every river bend, every abandoned shed within miles had been mapped, searched, and signed off. And yet, nothing. So complete it felt deliberate. The case didn't end in discovery. It dissolved into absence. Brandon Swanson had not left behind the things most people shed when they go missing. No dropped phone, no torn fabric, no footprint softening in the mud. The world simply closed around the space where he'd been and kept going. The ordinary rhythms of rural life resumed. Tractors in the fields, mailboxes rattling in the wind, porch lights flickering on at dusk. But for his family, every silence had weight. Investigators began calling it a clean disappearance. They meant it as a classification, not a compliment. Clean meant no traceable evidence, no narrative to anchor to. It meant that even the laws of probability seemed suspended, as if the night had rewritten its own rules. There's a particular kind of horror in that, when a place you know becomes capable of swallowing someone whole. The Swansons stood on those roads more times than they could count, eyes scanning the same stretch of horizon, wondering how something could both exist and not exist in the same breath. It was a grief built not on what was lost, but on the proof that nothing remained to find. Over time, the maps came down from the kitchen walls. The pins were stored in small plastic bags. But the search didn't stop. It just changed shape. Instead of grids and coordinates, it became questions whispered into the dark. Where are you? Why can't we find you? Nothing answered back. Reporters stopped calling. The search dogs were reassigned. The volunteers went home, quietly apologetic, as if quitting a vigil that had no end. Still, the Swansons refused to surrender. To the void. Annette kept a notebook by the phone, jotting down any new idea, no matter how small. Brian retraced routes late at night, headlights sweeping across the same intersections he'd driven that first morning. Hope, by then, wasn't expectation. It was duty. The case had become a paradox. Every failed lead reaffirmed the same impossible truth. The world had lost a person, without leaving a mark of his passage. The investigators called it no evidence. The family called it unacceptable. And somewhere within that difference, between official closure and a parent's refusal to accept it, something began to take root. Grief turned into momentum. The silence began to move. Because if the earth would not speak, then maybe the law could. The Swansons would soon find themselves standing not in the fields, but in the halls of the state capitol, holding their son's story up as proof that change had to come. The investigation might have reached its vanishing point, but for them, this was where the next chapter began. They couldn't find their son, but they could change the law for yours. Annette and Brandon Swanson never set out to become advocates. They were parents searching for a boy who hadn't come home. But when the searches quieted and the news cameras moved on, their grief found a new shape, one that refused to stay silent. The first time Annette realized how little protection adults had when they vanished, she was sitting in a county sheriff's office, hands folded, listening to procedure. The phrase, "he's legally an adult," had been used too easily, as if adulthood made someone immune to danger. That bureaucratic delay, the hours lost between a missing person's call and the start of an official search, was now personal. Every minute mattered, and they had lived what it meant to run out of them. So they began to ask questions. How many other families had called for help and been told to wait? How many names had vanished into paperwork instead of headlines? The answers weren't comforting. Letters followed. Meetings. Late-night drives to St. Paul for appointments with lawmakers who barely had time to read the names on their agendas. Annette carried a folder everywhere, its corners worn soft, filled with notes and the simple sentence that anchored everything. It shouldn't take this long to start looking. Each conversation opened another door. Each hearing drew quiet attention. Their son's story, his absence, became the evidence that change required. What began as a plea turned into a bill proposal, a law that would require law enforcement to respond immediately when an adult goes missing under suspicious or unsafe circumstances. They called it Brandon's Law. It wasn't about headlines or closure. It was about prevention, about making sure that no other family had to navigate the hesitation they'd endured. The law would force agencies to communicate, to share information, to act within the critical first hours when it still matters most. The process was long and bureaucratic, but grief has its own endurance. The Swansons sat through every committee, every reading, every vote. They spoke softly, never dramatizing, never accusing, just explaining. Their restraint made people listen. When the bill passed in 2009, applause filled the chamber. But for Annette and Brian, it didn't feel like victory. It felt like the smallest piece of balance in a world that had spun off its axis. The law would help others, yes, but it couldn't bridge the silence left in their home. Reporters asked how it felt. Annette answered carefully. "Good," she said, then paused. "But I'd trade it all for one more phone call." That's the thing about legacy. It's rarely chosen. It's built from what's left when everything else is gone. Today, Brandon's Law exists quietly in the background of every emergency call, every dispatch, every missing person alert that goes out within minutes instead of hours. Most people who benefit from it will never know his name, and that's exactly how his parents want it. The law was never meant to be about memory. It was meant to be about momentum. Still, in Marshall, when someone mentions it, the air seems to pause. Because here, everyone knows the cost. And as years pass, with the field still whispering the same unanswered questions, remembrance begins to take new forms. Ribbons, vigils, and a community that refuses to let his name fade. From law to legacy, from loss to endurance, Brandon's story isn't just about what was taken, but about what was built to keep others from disappearing into the same quiet. And with that endurance comes the next evolution of grief. Remembrance. Not in statutes or speeches, but in light. 15 years later, his number still rings, and people still leave messages. The sound hasn't changed. That same faint click, that pause before the voicemail tone. And then voices, some trembling, some steady, speaking into the void as if he might still be listening. "Hi, Brandon. We haven't forgotten you. Just in case you can hear this. We still believe you're out there somewhere." His parents have never disconnected the phone. It sits on a small table in their home, plugged into the same wall socket as the night he disappeared. Once a year, Annette scrolls through the saved messages, her finger hovering, never deleting, never quite ready to hit play. The silence between recordings feels heavier than the words themselves. Every May, Marshall turns lime green. Ribbons wrap around trees and mailboxes. Streetlights wear small bows that flutter in the evening wind. The color started as a family symbol of awareness and turned into a town-wide language, a gentle reminder that time may pass, but absence does not. The vigil takes place downtown, near the courthouse lawn. There's no podium, no speeches, just candles held in plastic cups, and the low hum of a crowd that knows each other by sight, if not by name. Some come every year, others drift in quietly, unsure what to say, but certain they should be there. Children who once heard the story in whispers now stand as adults, their phones lighting up the night alongside the candles. Local news crews film from the edge of the crowd, their lights cutting across faces dampened by wind. A reporter narrates softly about the enduring mystery, while behind her, a small boy ties another ribbon to the railing. There's no ceremony to it, no grandeur, just repetition, honest and human. The phone line, the ribbons, the vigil, each one is a small act of resistance against forgetting. They're not hope exactly, not in the easy way people mean. There's something quieter, a refusal to let silence define the story completely. Even now, the official case file remains open. Every few years, a new investigator revisits the evidence, hoping technology might catch up to the mystery. There's talk of using environmental DNA, isotopic mapping, or digital triangulation, modern tools that might one day turn the invisible into something measurable. But for the Swansons, progress isn't about new science, it's about persistence. Annette often says that hope is like static. It fades in and out, but it never fully goes away. Sometimes it's sharp and painful, other times it's barely audible, just a faint hum in the background of ordinary life. That hum is what the town hears every spring when the first ribbons appear. It's what drives the volunteers who still search the riverbanks, scanning for anything the thaw might reveal. And each May 14th, when the vigil ends and the candles are set down, the crowd disperses into the night with a single shared feeling, that the story isn't finished, that somewhere, hidden beneath years and miles, something still waits to be found. In that quiet, the phone rings again. Another message, another voice reaching out across an unbroken line. And from this steady communal heartbeat, the collective persistence of a town unwilling to stop asking, the next wave of searchers will emerge, armed with technology, curiosity, and the same question that's never gone away. What really happened to Brandon Swanson? Even now, strangers trace his last steps on Google Earth. You can zoom in far enough to see the faint texture of gravel, the winding path where his car was found, the curves of the Yellow Medicine River bending like veins through the farmland. The map loads slowly, as if the land itself resists being flattened into pixels. Somewhere in those coordinates, people imagine him still walking, calm, certain, and just a little lost. 15 years later, the case has entered its second life, the digital one. Online forums catalog every fragment, police reports, search grids, weather data, even soil composition. Sleuths debate theories across time zones, tracing the same invisible lines his parents once followed by headlight. Some analyze satellite imagery, comparing tree growth and water levels. Others build 3D models of the terrain, trying to predict where a single misstep could have changed everything. It's a strange form of faith, born not from religion, but from persistence, the belief that mystery can still yield to patience. Meanwhile, technology keeps advancing. Investigators now talk about forensic geolocation, drones with ground-penetrating radar, even environmental DNA that could one day detect a person's trace in the soil itself. It's a science that blurs the line between the physical and the ethereal, turning what was once unknowable into a data set. But so far, Brandon's absence remains stubbornly analog, a silence that resists algorithms. Searches still happen, quietly, without fanfare. A small group of volunteers meets every spring and fall, marking out new plots on digital maps before setting foot in the real world. They carry GPS trackers now, uploading coordinates as they walk, the hum of their devices mixing with the old sounds of boots and grass and wind through cattails. The methods have changed, but the intent hasn't. They're still looking for the same thing, a trace that time forgot to erase. Annette and Brian remain at the center of it, though age has softened their pace. Their kitchen table has become part archive, part command post, a place where newspaper clippings sit beside printed drone maps and USB drives labeled by year. The law that bears their son's name hangs framed above it, not as an end, but as a reminder that doing something is still better than surrender. To outsiders, the case is unsolved. To those who've lived inside it, it's ongoing, paused between questions. Every new search is both a renewal of effort and an act of remembrance. In a world of constant updates and instant answers, the Swanson case remains one of the few stories that hasn't been overwritten by certainty. And maybe that's why people still return to it. Not because they expect a sudden revelation, but because it represents the limits of what we know, the edge where data, devotion, and doubt converge. It's less a mystery to solve now, and more a mirror reflecting how humans respond to the unknown. The fields still stretch quiet and wide, their silence steady as breath. Yet the world keeps circling back, insisting on one more look, one more theory, one more chance. The passage of time hasn't dulled curiosity. It's deepened it, the way weather shapes stone, slowly, invisibly, but permanently. And as long as the questions remain, people will keep walking those same roads, digital or real, retracing steps through a darkness that refuses to give up what it holds. Because what began as a disappearance has become something else entirely, a meditation on memory itself, and the human refusal to let it fade. From that persistence, from that quiet, collective need to keep the story alive, comes the final realization, one that belongs less to investigation and more to faith. Faith that even when a person vanishes, their presence still changes the landscape they leave behind. And as we approach the final chapter, that presence lingers, like a voice caught on the wind, still calling from somewhere just beyond the reach of the signal. Maybe the land remembers what we cannot. In the southwest corner of Minnesota, the fields stretch wide and indifferent, gold in the summer, bone gray by October. Wind moves through the prairie grass like breath through memory, soft, rhythmic, alive. To most, it's an ordinary landscape. But to those who've searched here, every ridge, every hollow carries a question that still has no answer. Time has smoothed over the footprints and tire tracks, but it hasn't erased the story. It lingers in the hush between rows of corn, in the slow murmur of the yellow Medicine River, in the pulse of a town that learned what it means to look and never find. Out here, you can almost feel it, the weight of what's missing, the way absence becomes part of the terrain. The prairie doesn't lie. It doesn't confess either. It just endures, holding its secrets in plain sight. And maybe that's the hardest truth to face, that some mysteries don't end because they belong to the land now, folded into its silence. For Annette and Brandon Swanson, that silence has never been emptiness. It's something else. An echo that reminds them their son existed, that his story still moves, even if unseen. They still drive those same roads sometimes, windows down, listening. They say the wind sounds different out there, like it's speaking in half-remembered tones. Maybe that's imagination, or maybe it's something we don't yet have words for. Every spring, when the fields thaw and the ground softens, new volunteers arrive. They park along the roadside, check their GPS coordinates, and walk. Most find nothing, but that's never really the point. The act of searching has become its own form of prayer, a ritual of endurance, a conversation with the land that refuses to answer but always listens. Because what remains here isn't just tragedy, it's devotion. The human instinct to reach into the dark, even when the dark refuses, to reach back. It's love translated into persistence, and persistence, in its purest form, is a kind of hope. Maybe one day, the prairie will decide to give something up, a button, a thread, a bone. Or maybe it never will. Either way, the searching will continue, because remembering is its own kind of discovery. And that's where we leave this story, not with closure, but with reverence. For a boy whose voice once carried across a midnight line. For a family who turned silence into change. For a town that still ties ribbons to its lampposts, still listens when the wind comes low. The prairie keeps its secrets, yes. But in doing so, it keeps us honest, reminding us that some truths don't live in evidence or answers. They live in the act of never stopping, in the courage to keep asking, and in the quiet belief that the land is listening. And somewhere out there, beneath that wide, unbroken sky, the story of Brandon Swanson still moves with the wind, unseen, but never forgotten.